Okay.
Okay. So, Nick, last weekend we had that webinar on the crisis, or at least what some people regard as the current crisis in psychoanalysis. Dan Burston presented his paper, and I was the discussant. And after the two papers, it was open to a Q&A. And we had a good deal of discussion. But towards the end of the meeting, you put your question into the Q&A, and Neil read it back, but it was a long question. There were several sub-clauses, and it was a little too much. Coming at the end of the meeting, it didn't really get adequately addressed. So why don't you clarify what you were really asking, and let's have a little discussion about that.
Sure. So I guess first of all, I'll say I think part of the confusion was that I began the question using the word analysans rather than patience. I wanted to ask if there was any thought about how analysans, patients under analysis, might be disadvantaged or harmed by undue disclosures of the analyst's political stance, wherever it falls on the spectrum, right or left wing, it doesn't matter to me. It's the self-disclosure of the politics. I think my suggestion was that it might foreclose the area of the patient's fantasy about that very material, and in that way set back analytic process at best, and at worst cause the patient a kind of crisis, a kind of painful experience of difference for which they're not ready, or even moral coercion, and potentially harm the analytic process, if not the patient, him or herself.
Right, right. Okay, so just to make it perfectly clear, you're making a distinction between um, how the analyst behaves outside the analytic session as opposed to how he or she behaves in the psychoanalytic session. In other words, an analyst might show up at a protest march, and the patient may see him at that march, or may see him in a news clip, or as in my case, the patient might find many of my lectures on my YouTube channel.
Yes.
And but that's discovering things about me, and that's me disclosing things about myself outside the session. And that's quite different than in session with the patient, disclosing or advocating a particular. And I think you don't just mean political views. I think you mean more than that. You mean moral stances,
Religious views.
religious views, philosophical positions,
Yeah.
even aesthetic tastes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I
Okay.
mean, I think analysts are clinicians, but they're also private citizens with the freedom to pursue outside of their work the ends that concern them, and that is not what I'm worried about. I don't care what bars an analyst goes to, or what political organizations, or any of that. That's a matter of their private individual freedom.
Hmm. I'm
Uh,
smiling, Nick. I'm smiling because I'm remembering a video you shared with me years ago, and it was about Baba Ram Dass telling about how he was in a lineup to go into a porn flick.
right.
And some of his disciples, I guess, were going in or passing and saw him in this position, right?
Yeah.
So that's his private life.
which is an interesting matter, but that's not my concern here.
Right. Right.
As you think you said in the meeting, that could easily be recovered as grist for the analytic mill. And I do agree with you about that. It may be a disruption, but as Kohut emphasizes, the disruption repair cycle has a tendency to move things forward.
But you can imagine certain patients where it wouldn't move forward. Certain patients might see me in one of those disclosing positions and might say, my God, I can't possibly be in analysis with someone who thinks that way or
Yeah,
writes that way or does that sort of thing. I mean, but they would be probably much more fragile patients. Some fragile patients might not be able to take it, which is also worth thinking about because, I mean, if you do decide to have a YouTube channel and speak up in public forums, you may be limiting your practice to some extent.
yeah, and I do understand that there was an era of analytic developments that was very concerned about that. But I still think that the ethics of that is a little different. It wouldn't be a willful enactment of
Right.
your individual concerns. It would be an accident, a collateral, something
Yeah.
a little morally different.
Right. I think there's no doubt that some analysts, well, maybe all analysts in different contexts, different ways, but who hold very passionate views about certain things. I mean, it could be causes very, very close to their personhood in various ways. I won't spell out the possibilities, but here is the analyst holding these passionate views, and there's the patient lying on the couch, and the patient is displaying behaviors and attitudes that just are kind of anathema to the analyst. And the analyst may have trouble containing himself or herself. He really wants, well, he might be wanting to reproach and scold the patient, or I mean, he might be wanting to educate the patient. He may feel that the patient's views are so ignorant, so off base, so lacking in realistic foundation that the analyst sort of justifies stepping in as an educator, justifies it as enhancing the patient's reality testing or something. The patient is so, you know, my patient might have some cockamamie conspiracy theory that he's deeply involved with and that he takes quite literally. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is utter bloody nonsense. I might have a hard time not weighing in and letting him know. This gets complicated because let's not talk about the patient having conspiracy theories. Let's talking about a patient.
Talk about that for a moment, because I do
Oh
have
yeah, okay.
I think, you know, for me, what's procedurally important is to focus on a kind of defense analysis over disclosure of where we stand in relation to, for instance, the conspiracy theory. Just saying, I think you're out of touch,
Yeah.
is destructive and won't go anywhere and won't be able to be received by the patient in a productive way.
Right.
Rather than focusing, making a client kind of directed interpretation about why they might be motivated to believe those things,
Absolutely.
as opposed to a kind of rugged disconfirmation on the basis of our point of view.
Yeah, no, I agree with you entirely about that. In the moral domain, the patient is telling me how he chronically steals things and benefits in his business by collecting things that so-called fall off the back of the truck. He's telling me about his illegal behavior. I certainly am not weighing in and saying tisk tisk, it's wrong to steal. What I am doing though is sitting back waiting to see evidence of the consequences of his behavior. I mean, does he start to punish himself? I might be able to say, do you know, have you noticed every time you cheat on your wife, the migraines come? You see, I'm not disapproving, I'm not scolding him for cheating on his wife. I'm just pointing out that every time he does, he gets the migraines. Um, so that's kind of in alliance with the point that you just made, you know. It's the
Yeah,
same principle. It's the same principle. But look, these things get really complicated because what if it's more than a conspiracy? What if there is something frankly psychotic in what the patient is saying? And you know, the patient wants you to believe in this paranoid theory that he or she has. Um, what do you do then? I mean, you can sit back in the bushes and it would be very unusual to affirm the psychotic delusion, although there are analysts who believe that that's how you work with psychosis sometimes. I'm talking about some of the um, paradoxical people who will actually join the resistance and sometimes will go so far almost as to affirm the delusion as a way of helping the patient out of it. But that is very marginal and controversial work. I mean, most analysts will not do that. Um, but they're not going to. What if the patient forces you? What if they say to you, well, do you believe that there is this uh, conspiracy going on against me, or do you not, doctor?
right.
What are you going to say? You know, or take MPD, the whole multiple personality disorder. Okay, the patient comes and he says, I've got multiple, you know, and of course I think that's all nonsense. I don't believe that MPD exists. But am I going to say I don't believe it? No, I'm going to say, look, I find it very interesting that you believe this, and I really want to know all about it. When did you first start believing this? And how do you think believing this may serve you? Those are the kind of questions. But if he pushes it and he says, well, okay, but do you believe me or not? I'm going to say, no, I don't. But I'm very interested that you do.
Uh-huh. I don't want to get into the weeds because that's another value-laden discussion about DID and whether it's real, but I'd like to reference a New Yorker cartoon that I saw where the analyst said, for a moment, may I speak to the personality who pays the fee?
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
But what I keep harping on here is technical neutrality as an ideal, not a rule, but a necessary ideal. I know that Freud never used the term himself, but I think that Kernberg uses it in a way that is constructive. So I think that what you say in the face of the psychotic delusion is, I believe that you believe that.
Right,
Can we think about how that might function for you right now and why it's
right.
coming up between us? And if they pressure you to disclose what you believe, I think you say that that's not relevant. That's not part of the analytic process. That it would not be useful to you. It would be
Well,
it
or
would
you could say that may not be useful for you now, but if you insist, um, it might be more useful for you to let me know what you imagine I think. But if at the end of that they're still pressing to know what you think, it might be in some situations it might be right to tell them.
maybe I'm not sure about that. I've had a certain amount of success recently in these very circumstances, telling patients, what I believe or my private concerns and even my struggles might be interesting to you. You might like to know about it, but it would also be a burden to you.
Yeah, you can get a long way that way with certain patients, but you will encounter the patient who, after all of that, says, so what do you think?
Hmm.
um, So just shifting a little bit, I
I
mean,
think you're trying to turn the tables. That's what I think.
okay, and that may go somewhere useful too. But just the issue of technical neutrality. Now here, I'm going to move a little bit in the direction, but only an inch or two in the direction of the relational analysts who would say, they would scoff and they would say there's no such thing as technical neutrality. And of course, they're right. It's impossible. What does Freud say at the end of the Dora case? He who has eyes to see and ears to hear may convince himself that no mortal can keep a secret. If his lips are silent, he chatters with his fingertips. Betrayal oozes out of him at every pore. Freud meant the patient leaks, but of course the analyst leaks. And we leak far more than we know we leak. And the patients pick up on far more about us than we think they do. So technical neutrality, complete neutrality, is utterly impossible. The relational analyst will say, and then they will use that fact as an excuse to not strive to be as technically neutral as we can be.
Which is
So
why I called it a
an
necessary
ideal.
ideal and not a superego driven rule. The same way
Exactly.
I would say for free association with the patient.
Right.
You can really be truly uncensored at all times.
You know what Hans Sachs said?
No.
He said, when the patient can truly free associate, the analysis is over.
Right, right. I didn't know that was Sachs. I kind of thought that was also a Lacanian attitude.
No, that's Hans Sachs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think it's an invitation and an ideal
Right.
more than an absolute rule.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. It's an ideal.
And of course, we leak things in our countertransference. But analysis does involve an asymmetry. The patient lies on the couch. We
Yeah.
don't. We go in the chair. They talk.
Patient pays the bill. We collect the money.
Right. They talk. We listen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so this all implies to me that there is an imperative type of restraint, which is in a way being rationalized against by the relational tendency
Yeah.
and abandoned in favor of a kind of idea of mutuality and authenticity.
Yeah. But you have to admit that that itself is an undialectical reaction to what are called the neoclassical analysts. Freud did not do that. In his notes, the wolfman was hungry. Freud says, I gave him, what's that fish? That kind of fish. I gave him, anyway, he fed him.
Herring,
Uh,
pickerel,
yeah,
whatever.
herring. I fed him herring, Freud says. Freud was not that cold, distant, mirror surgeon like neutral analyst. He wasn't like that at all. But the next generation after Freud, they took what Freud meant as just kind of general guidelines, and they raised them into like mosaic tablets brought down from God Himself, and they made these into, and they tried to ape this mirror-like idea. Robert Langs, I understand, was paying twice the rent in Manhattan because he insisted on having an office with a completely separate entrance and exit, so patients would never run into one another. He wore pretty much the same suit. He had no art on the walls. He tried to be absolutely a mirror so that everything would be the patient's transference fantasy. That's going crazy. I mean, he's trying to not reveal himself, but in his crazy way of not revealing himself, he was revealing himself as crazy.
Yeah,
Um, so, and the some of the extreme relational people are reacting, and we have to remember that that kind of cold thing, it really did exist. I mean, I trained in the 70s, but I mean, I encountered it in older analysts. On my YouTube channel, there's a video lecture that I did on the still face, and a particular psychologist, I forget his name, was doing research with kids, and he would have the mom and the little kid sitting, maybe a 2-year, 3-year-old. And for the first 2 minutes, mom and the kid were smiling and goo-gooing at each other and playing. And then the mother is instructed to make her face go blank and to turn to one side. And no matter what, the kid thinks it's a game. He tries to get her back. She's not coming back. And then the kid gets angry. And then the kid starts to cry. And then the kid just goes blank into a depression. And then after 2 minutes, the mother is instructed to come back and start interacting again. And the kid comes to life. And in the video, I said, this is a perfect illustration of crucifixion and resurrection. I mean, the kid kind of dies psychologically and then comes back to life. And so, given that research, how could analysts have ever thought that the blank screen could possibly be therapeutic? Okay, so they're reacting against something extreme, but they've gone to the other extreme, and we need to find a dialectical third position. And of course, different analysts are going to differ on this because we all have different personalities. I'm more self-disclosing than a lot of my colleagues, but I don't take up 49 of the 50 minutes disclosing facts about myself. I mean, it's the patient session. I force myself to shut up. I listen. Some people are much less disclosing than I am. We all find our own personality and our own style as we acquire experience.
Yeah, I completely agree, but I think there's a conflation here that needs to be addressed, because I don't think that technical neutrality, the way it's actually defined in the literature, ever meant lack of warmth, sympathy,
No.
or the kind of abandonment of the patient that would be involved in what you call the still face. That
But
is
some
actually,
dumb analysts behave that way.
I know, but it's not neutral, it's a punishment.
They didn't see it that way. They thought they were being neutral. They might have been quite well-meaning. They might have learned what from the neoconservatives. They might have learned the rules, and they might have been trying to adhere to the rules. You know. So, well, anyway, these things are dialectical, and I think we agree we need to find some reasonable point of a midpoint here. Between these two extremes. But it is, coming back to an earlier point, it is very hard for analysts who are passionately politically committed or religiously committed. It's very difficult for them to contain these countertransference impulses to correct, reproach, educate. Boy, that is the kind of self-restraint that an analyst has to develop as he or she matures. I mean, it's all about self-control.
Yeah, I won't sit here and say that I haven't done it. I'm trying to learn from the experience of having it go very south after having done it.
Right.
Because I think what it is, often it's a rationalization of a kind of narcissistic self-indulgence.
Yes.
Of bringing too much of one's own will and burdening the patient with it in a destructive enactment.
Absolutely. Bringing too much of oneself because one is too preoccupied with oneself.
Yes, and I think it's a bit, well, it all depends on how we collect our fee, but I think part of what patients are compensating us for is the hard work that goes into providing our undivided attention and bracketing our personal concerns for the 50 minutes.
Right. So let's bring it back to the wars in psychoanalysis and to CSJT, critical social justice theory. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that many, if not most, of the CSJT people are far more interested in their politics and their causes than they are in psychoanalysis. I'm not sure many of them know very much about psychoanalysis in the first place. Oh, and then a further point. Everybody uses the term psychoanalysis. And a lot of the time, they're referring to something like vaguely psychodynamic therapy. people seem to be losing the distinction between once a week, even psychoanalytic psychotherapy, and psychoanalysis, which is 3 or 4 times a week on the couch with the analyst sitting behind. But I think CJST people are very politically, passionately committed. And I think that means far more to them than properly conducting an analysis or even a psychotherapy, frankly. So I think these people are very much in danger of really misusing the therapy or the analytic situation in the service of their passionate causes. Not that I'm saying there's anything wrong with their causes, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong about being passionate about one's cause, but if you choose to be a clinician, you're taking on an obligation to the patient comes first.
Yeah. And this whole thing for me is motivated by a lack of clarity about what the call to action, the imperative to be an activist analyst actually means. Nobody
Yes.
spells it out. Do you mean that we have an obligation to be politically engaged outside of our work with patients or inside of our work with patients? And what is it actually supposed to look like for technique? I don't have the answers, but I want the conversation to happen.
Yes, yes, yes.
It seems to me rather vague on that issue, and
Right.
that's a problem.
Is this where we should cap it, or do you have anything else that you want to say about this?
That's up to you. Do you have questions or distinctions or counterpoints you'd like to?
No, I don't think so. I think we've covered it. I just think, we have to have compassion for these passion-filled people.
Mhm.
And that in itself is not a problem. I just think we have to be clear that in the old Westerns, the gunslinger had to check his 6-gun at the door to the saloon. Maybe we have to kind of check our impassioned political, religious, whatever stances. We have to check them at the door of the consulting room. My friend Elio Frateroli, fine analyst in Philadelphia, he refers to the clinical consulting room as a sacred space. And I learned from my old mentor, Eli Sagan, that we cannot allow religion to colonize the sacred. There is a secular sacred, the life of a child, democratic principles, whatever.
Yeah.
And I agree with him that the clinical consulting room is a sacred space. And this is a space that has to be treated as sacred and not violated in all these different ways.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think there's an alternative way to say the same thing, which is that it's a liminal place.
Yeah.
It's a place apart and in between where
Yeah.
we offer something very particular,
Yes.
which is not supposed to be contaminated by what
Oh, yeah.
happens outside.
Well, that just gave rise to another thought. Many writers have described totalitarianism as precisely the elimination of private spaces, elimination of privacy, elimination of the privacy of the self.
Yeah.
The secrets, the secret service people may be listening. So there's something a little totalitarian about bringing one's politics into what should be for the patient the private space of the consulting room.
And the private space of their mind. They give us access to their unconscious, which is a very vulnerable act.
Yes,
And
yes.
I think we need to respect that by being restrained, being neutral, which also doesn't mean being
Not being
unempathic.
neutral, not being neutral, striving to be neutral.
Okay. But
Yeah,
so some will say that if you're neutral in the face of oppression, you reinforce oppression.
yeah.
But
And that's probably quite true in the outer world of politics, but we're not talking about the outer world of politics. We're talking about this special sacred space of the psychoanalytic encounter.
Well, I do think that you can join the patient's sense of their distress at their marginalization without disclosing your personal politics either. It's a fine balance to maintain, but I think that's what we're called upon to do.
Well, okay, but I agree. But let's look at the other side of that as well. Like if the patient is telling me something that he is doing that I believe is deeply destructive and immoral, I'm going to be silent. And the patient is going to read my silence because I'm not always silent. He's going to hear what's behind the silence. He won't know for sure. I'm not telling him I'm horrified by his behavior. But the fact that I've gone silent and do not address it. Now, there are times in the analysis when I would address it, usually late in the analysis or well into the analysis, several years into the analysis. But at the beginning, if you hope to get anywhere with such a patient, you can't address it. But I'm probably going to be rendered silent.
Yeah. Sergio Benvenuto's book in the last chapter about weaning from perversion talks about some of these issues, but he doesn't say we abandon technical neutrality, but he sort of implies that there is a possibility to use the leakages constructively.
Yeah, that's an
In some
interesting
ways,
idea.
our silences can be conditioning.
Yeah. And they can be leakage. I mean, in being silent, I'm leaking. He's driven me into silence.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, these are the thorny issues of psychoanalytic technique. And let's face it, there is no science of this. This is the art of psychoanalysis. We can talk about these general principles, but putting them into practice is part of the art of psychoanalysis.
Yeah, but for me, the moral problem is about willfulness. It's about what you consciously try to do to the patient, as
Yeah.
opposed to what you accidentally do because you also have an unconscious.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Okay, let's hold it there.
Okay.
Okay.